during these presentations, go ahead and put them in the chat. And basically what we're going to do is we have had some interesting projects happening in the studio this semester as usual, but we're going to have people talk about what they've been doing. So we have Dustin, who's had his commissioning project and his CD recording project, and I hope you have lots of questions for him. And then I've asked Emily to talk about her choreography project, but she's hurt her ankle, so she can't actually move for us today, but she has a recording. And she's going to kind of talk about the process. And a number of us have already been working with the choreography process. So Ethan, did you say you have to leave early? Wait.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So just go ahead and go if you need to. And I know that a number of us have been working on choreography. So I think the one with Emily will be interesting because I'd like to hear people chime in, like Nathan and Carissa on just, and Jacob on like your process and how we've been exploring it in lessons. And then the third person, not in any order, well, we can do it in this order, is Jacob. And Jacob's been working on some ornamentation, but specifically on a piece, in a piece written by Hoteter. And so there were some interesting terms that came up, and Hoteter is a historical figure in the flute world who actually wrote a book on ornamentation. It's one of the standard important books. And he was a prolific composer and like I think even an inventor, maybe. Jacob, I don't know if you got that in there, but he had some inventions on the instrument. So that's what we have for today. It's going to be really fun. So I think we just start with Dustin, then go to Emily and go to Jacob, and Sammy's going to keep time for us. And take it away, Dustin.
Okay, yeah, sure. So as Professor mentioned, and I'm sure you've probably seen, my debut album, Rira, will be coming out a week from this Friday. And I figured the easiest way to do this was just kind of screen share and kind of talk through the process as how it started and just how it went along and how I've learned things along the way. So
are we recording this also, Dustin?
Yes, I am recording this.
Excellent. This will be fun for people to, future generations to look at.
Yeah, so right here, what I have up, everyone can see my screen, right? Okay, what I have here is where I kind of began. So I had a piece in mind that was inspired by the ney, which is a Middle Eastern, Arabic, Persian, reed flute. And I had received another piece of an Iranian composer to premiere through a professor. And we had the idea, why don't I do an album kind of surrounded about that? But 2 pieces isn't enough for an album. So I went to this site, and this was probably the best way I found to submit a call for scores. And so I'm at this site. All you go to is, it's the composersite.com. And I went to submit and then create an opportunity. And you just fill out this form. And with things like, if there's an entry fee, I didn't have an entry fee because I just wanted to get as many submissions as possible. I had no idea how many people would be interested in submitting their scores. And I set an expiration date of 3 months from when I submitted it. And I also allowed myself a month to select the works and notify the composers that the works have been selected. I also went through, I think, this site, New York Women Composers Incorporated, to try to solicit works by women composers as well, to just get as diverse a palette of composers as I could for this album. And what is this? Oh, yeah, we won't talk about that quite yet. But anyways, so over the course of 3 months, I received plenty of works. Some were new, and I included that in my note. that they would send me PDFs to my email. I also put up a page on my website with the call for scores and linked to that through what was submitted. And I received over 70 from composers all over the world. And of those, I think I selected 6. And then I notified them. We talked about, I congratulated them, and then we started drafting a contract that involved things like, let me share that for a second so you can kind of see what that looks like. For a mechanical license is what it's called. So they're making sure that you have the rights to the recording that you make, and that things like including parts of their scores and small clips of like practice sessions, like for my social media that I could share, and giving them the rights to also use that, getting the rights to use their name, and just their work on the recording. And we made negotiations. They said, oh, this should be a non-exclusive right or whatever. And then they signed it. The other thing then was I went through Mons Hills Records, which is the record company associated with the kind of music industry and recording arts program here at WVU. And they had a separate contract that I signed, which is just a lot of stuff. You know, make sure you read through that, and things like how things are going to be distributed, what they own the rights to, who has the right to, like what percentage of funds received for a commercial CD, all things like that. Not super interesting. But then I guess now I can talk about the actual recording process. Once I got all the works and started practicing and learning the pieces, they incorporated a lot of contemporary techniques. And one thing I thought that was rather prevalent throughout each of the works was an finer control of Aeolian sound and moving between complete Aeolian sound and a mixed tone, 2-tone on one note, and many other things. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of questions come in right now. So
You could keep, Dustin, you can kind of stay in flow. I'm sort of
okay,
watching the questions.
sure.
Just kind of present, and then we can.
Yeah, well, someone asked about the criteria for my call for scores. So I wanted to keep it short. So I asked for works for members of the flute family, including bass flute, alto flute, C flute, and piccolo, either solo or with electronics. And I asked that they not be any longer than 6 minutes. And I said I would give, because I had an idea for the theme and trying to represent music from the Middle East and my fascination with non-Western flutes and how the music cultures can exchange in the context of contemporary Western, you know, classical music. And so I said special consideration to works either by composers of Middle Eastern descent and or inspired by musical traditions from the Middle East. And so all of the composers that I ended up selecting were had Middle Eastern descent, mostly from the countries of Iran and Lebanon, who either may have done their studies in the US or in Canada, or some that are completely based in Iran and Lebanon and did their studies at, like, say, the Conservatory of Tehran.
So you had a description of what you were looking for or special considerations. You had a description of the length, the instrumentation, and even maybe the new music, you know, the extended technique component.
Yep. and they would send me an email with a PDF of their score. I specified that I would like it as a PDF or as a Dropbox link, but preferably a PDF file so I could quickly peruse the score. And in selecting them, obviously my main criteria of trying to keep this theme for the album was one of the biggest ones. I received a submission like the piece Miniatures from Phoenicia is 3 movements and ended up being 9 minutes long, but it fit the project idea I had so well that I accepted it, even if it wasn't, you know, under 6 minutes. And I forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, it was very simple. If they asked questions over email, I just responded, and they would be like, "Is this okay?" And I said, "Throw anything my way, and I'll look at it." And then I would play through them and kind of sight read them and look at them and make the executive decision of sometimes this is so involved and I don't think it's necessarily worth it, or maybe some works were by younger students that I didn't think have maybe fully developed their voice, or some things were just the notation would have been so difficult to decipher and you couldn't really tell what they wanted that maybe it wouldn't be worth the time.
Dustin, I don't recall whether we did this or not, but did you request a MIDI file too? We talked about MIDI.
Yes, I did ask that if they were able to provide a MIDI file that they do that, and many people did. Some people didn't. I definitely got submissions where I feel like people were just submitting and didn't necessarily even like read the call because they were just sending anything and everything. But it was very interesting. There were still plenty of works that were really good, but just maybe didn't fit my project description of this kind of really narrow kind of subgenre of music. But I thought they were very helpful, and many of the composers just want someone to play their music. So they were very fine. I thought being clear up front about the entire project, you know, I had it linked to my page. They knew who I was. They knew what I wanted from them. Was very important in that. One of the main things was that I'm a master's student, a poor college student, and you aren't necessarily going to be compensated financially at all for this project. It's more just to get the music out there, have the music played, have a good recording. And one of the stipulations that I thought was very important was, even though the recordings are going to be released commercially, I will provide them, each composer, with their respective piece recording that's all mixed and finalized for them to use.
One of the questions I get a lot regarding new music and also recording and commissioning of new music is, where do I find the funding for it? And you and I discussed it, because I think you were like, well, I don't have money to commission, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just important for everybody to hear what Dustin just said. And I think it was a pretty surprising for you, Dustin, in terms of how many pieces you got. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're willing to provide the composer with a performance or a recording, then oftentimes you won't have to pay a commissioning fee, unless they're so famous that they don't really want to do that, except for in one case, in many cases actually, in one of my projects, you know, Libby Larson wrote me a piece, and her fee is like $7,000 per minute of music, and she wrote me a 3-minute piece for free. And it was because she was really invested in the concept of the project, which was a project that supported women composers and a bunch of other things like literature and stuff like that. So making the project be like palatable and exciting for a composer is part of the success of getting so many submissions and not having to, you know, pay fees for commissioning.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight that. So let's go to some questions here. Juan asked, how often did you communicate with the composer regarding the interpretation of the work? So could you talk a little bit about what you learned in terms of flexibility of what you see on the page, and whether a composer is willing to change it or take in your input as a flute player?
Yeah. So actually, every composer's work were not flutist composers. So their main instrument was not flute. So sometimes the notation wasn't either completely idiomatic for our instrument. And so I would communicate with them kind of regularly if there was a specific thing on their piece, because also most of these pieces had either never been performed in that I would be premiering them, or they maybe had one premiere. And maybe one or a couple other people had played them at most. And so oftentimes I think the number one culprit would be multiphonics, and that the fingerings provided weren't necessarily what the instrument actually produced and what was written.
There's a notoriously annoying book out there. I think we've talked about this book, Jacob, but it's a notoriously annoying book that every composer has because they think it's the book you need to get multiphonics for the flute. And like, they're just like, these fingerings are wrong, it's crazy. So a lot of them use that particular book, I think.
Yeah, and so I found with those, more often than not, I would actually have to supply them and just cross out and write my own fingerings that I researched and could play and say, okay, this is what actually works. Or sometimes you just have to take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes people write big swells on multiphonics, and sometimes it's more like you should be happy if you get them.
You had a bit of a process there too that I think would be important to share about, and that is, when we are young and are handed music, it's like anything that's printed is like the law, right? And you learn that a crescendo means you crescendo, and it has to be specifically where it's marked. And then you get a little older, and maybe you do something in Sibelius or Finale, and you're like, oh wow, it's really hard to move that crescendo over. So you start to kind of think broader, like, well, maybe they didn't actually. I think that you want. Yeah. So and so you went through a little bit of this process.
5 minutes.
Thank you, that I remember. And that's sort of like, well, this is what they wrote. And I'm like, email them and tell them you don't want it. And you provided some alternates, even like Asia's. And can you talk a little bit about that process for you just as an artist, and sort of what you feel like you came out of that with, in terms of like, oh, okay, here's.
Yeah, and that was particularly relevant to the interpretation of a lot of the pieces in this project, in that oftentimes they were trying to mimic one kind of traditional form is a taksim, which is an improvisational solo form of the ney. And so they would write things like dotted sixteenths and dotted quarters with like no time signature, and a triplet under a quintuplet. And some works in like that are in new complexity and such would say that's exactly what you need to do.
Dustin, you muted yourself.
Sorry. In that they were just trying to convey freedom, and it's hard to necessarily notate those freedoms on the page.
So would you say that you've walked away from the experience? I'm sorry, I'm kind of rushing you through this just because of time, but would you say that you walked through the experience with, that you've come through the experience with a different understanding for what might be printed on the page?
Yeah, and especially use of silence was really important in a lot of these recordings. And almost always you can use more in that you actually rush yourself because you're thinking of all the notes to come, and just to take time in those rests to when you can use them.
Yeah, so really the big takeaway is that just because something's printed doesn't mean it's the law. And oftentimes composers, I've had this happen many times in commissions, like pianists will take this big thing and do this thing that we would interpret as a slur, and for them it's not a slur, it's a phrasing. So just one more question, two more quick questions. A very quick answer to what, I'm sure you had more pieces than the 6 that you actually liked. Can you tell us just a quick answer to what you're going to do with the other pieces that came in potentially. And then I want a quick answer for how you organize your semester plan and like what were the challenges for organizing, learning the music, working with the composers, having them be in lessons so we could go deep into each piece and then getting it recorded.
Yeah. Okay. So the first question, the quick answer is, there were the ones that I liked, I used the different color stars and I created a folder in Gmail. And if I liked them, but they didn't fit the project, they got a different color star. And I haven't gotten back to them, but there may be future projects where maybe contemporary flute works inspired by East Asian flute traditions, maybe another album in the making, perhaps, who knows. And if they would be interested in just performance, I would definitely be willing to give them that. The second question, basically I would plan weeks ahead of time to view it, review it, have it in a lesson or two, and then have a week or two to work on my own. And then I scheduled it so that I moved things around so that Fridays I pretty much would have no classes at WVU, and those would be dedicated to recording. So I would set up recording from 11 to 1 or 2 p.m. on Fridays. And then I would get into the school, warm up for like 2 hours before that, give myself time to go over and record in 2 to 3 hour sessions. And
in closing, when can we expect to see the CD?
Well, it is a digital only release, but it is releasing a week from this Friday, a week after my recital.
And I vote for, we have a CD release party for Dustin. Maybe Sammy, that can be coordinated with the picnic thing or something, but I say we celebrate because it's a huge deal to be a master's student and have your, I mean, I've told some of the professors here about this and they're just like blown away because like, that's something you do maybe when you're on tenure trying to like make your recordings, but it's huge that Dustin has this. And if you're interested in doing it, or if I've mentioned to you that maybe, excuse me, you should be considering a project like this, please come speak with me because Dustin is living proof of the possibility. Okay, so now we're going to go to Emily. Dustin, thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but chat with him about it. It's really exciting what he's doing.
So many questions.
Yeah, okay, Emily.
Hello. So as Professor had mentioned, before I'll be kind of talking about the process of choreographing reflections that I've been working on for a few weeks now. So first, I do have a clip of it in video that I'm going to share my screen that we can watch. Okay. And so in this recording of it, this will be about the first page, and there are a few spots where I'm just standing around, which I actually worked on in a lesson yesterday, kind of filling in some of those gaps. This is the pre-video of that. Can everyone hear that? No?
I can't hear it, and it looks like it's in the middle of the recording too for some reason.
Oh yeah, the first part's just me talking about.
I'm going to mute myself in case I'm part of the culprit here, but I wasn't able to hear it.
Okay, sorry, how do I share the sound?
On the top bar where you have all the commands, all the way over to the right, there's 3 dots.
Oh, okay.
You click on that and then share sound.
Okay, we should be good now. Better? So, oh, thank you, Ethan. Hi, Ethan. So that is, yeah, that was about the first page and a half of that. Um, so with that, a lot of the choreography came out of kind of exploring different ways to move with professors. So kind of side-to-side movements versus up and down kind of movements. And so I think at least my process for the choreographing was kind of thinking about in a specific section how I felt it in a way. So whether I kind of saw it as an upward motion, downward motion, side to side. In that part, there are parts that I saw kind of as static movements, like the repeated quarter notes, kind of a static motions. And so with that, I kind of took that idea and then thought about different ways to go about incorporating that kind of emotion or feeling into it. And I also thought about different, because like I used to dance and I used to figure skate, so maybe different kind of dance moves or figure skating ideas that I could also incorporate into the choreography. And then I also thought about sort of what I could do while playing the flute, also keeping in mind my playing abilities in with that. So yeah, definitely. Professor mentioned in one of my lessons that recording it would be really, really helpful, which it definitely has been, especially if I've been practicing in a room that didn't have a mirror. And also a lot of times during the movement, I can't see what I'm doing during it. So it's definitely helpful. It's been helpful for me to record it and then go back and look at it. I've also kind of thought about when I set up my phone to record it, that's what the audience is seeing. So I'm kind of able to imagine what I'm presenting to the audience. So remembering the choreography, for some of the sections, I think when I choreographed it, it felt natural enough. So it kind of just stuck in my brain. This was the movement I did. But a lot of times in recordings, I would start out saying, okay, I'm going to play from this section to this section, and then I would do that section so I'd have it on record. And then I also use different color blocks for specific sections, and then wrote that out on a separate piece of paper that I could refer to at a later time, which also definitely helped with that.
Are you ready for some more questions, Emily?
Sure, yep.
Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that you faced in terms of technique and playing challenges and the movements you were exploring, and whether you ditched any movements that you had in mind because it interfered with your technique, or how you kind of worked through it and embedded good technique and good sound? Because actually her playing was really commendable on even her pitch was excellent on those movements. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of your process?
Yeah, so I think at least movement wise, I think the biggest challenge I had was not being able to think of something to do, kind of talking about the movement part. So that was probably my biggest challenge for that. But then I think gradually just different ideas kind of formed, which eventually became an actual kind of movement. As for the playing, I think another big challenge was in the beginning when there are those different kind of air slides and harmonic notes, where I personally consider them, I need a good bit of kind of body control in order to make the slide pitch the way I want it to sound, or to make the harmonics come out clearly. So in the beginning, since I'm starting kind of bent over, trying to do the F-sharp slide while kind of swinging back and getting to your staying position. That was definitely a challenging moment, trying to have that fine control while still incorporating the whole body into that. But I think the way that I've been trying to mitigate the challenge is just isolating those specific moments and then practicing them, or thinking, how can I modify the movement a little bit to help the pitch come out better?
Great. We have a question, good question here from Katie.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the piece started out with maybe 5 or 6 defined moments that I worked on in lessons. So like 6 anchor points, very defined parts. And then from there, I kind of worked on different movements in between those sections, and then eventually incorporating those, incorporating in transitional movements. So how do I get from this point to this point? And then eventually that kind of covers the whole piece. So yeah, there are definitely ideas and movements that I've had since the beginning. Those were those kind of anchor points which helped kind of anchor me down into the piece.
Are you develop? I think maybe Katie
Mhm.
is wondering, and or I'm certainly wondering on behalf of everybody. So let's say you're gonna stick your leg up like this, and you've got this move down. In the process of playing the piece, and being a week later, say in your process, do you find yourself kind of going, "Oh, I wonder if I could just maybe tilt this"? Are you like nuancing the moves as after sort of the like scaffolding of them, or the template of them are in place? Do you find yourself kind of exploring finesse?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if I've been per se totally changing the actual move, but as I've been working on and developing it, I've definitely gotten more comfortable with the moves. So I've been able to involve more of my body, so it just flows better. Versus when I first try a move out or first start, it's very stiff looking. So it's definitely gotten just more fluid, I think, throughout the process.
Okay, other questions? I've got more, but I'm not going to ask them yet.
So, how much would you say that your dance and figure skating background has influenced your decisions? And do you ever reference or watch any videos for inspiration on moves for your choreography?
So I would definitely say yes. Kind of the whole dancing figure skating has definitely influenced it. Even just with transitional movements, so thinking, oh, what kind of turn can I put here, or even things of line and pose, which I got a lot from dance, I think. So yeah, those moves have definitely influenced the piece. Sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Do you find yourself watching any videos for dance move inspiration or anything like that to help you fill out the choreographed sections that aren't fully choreographed, for lack of a better word?
I've watched some videos. I know Professor was showing me some like fusion dancing in a lesson one time, and just kind of talking about different isolation of body parts, which has definitely helped. So yes, I would say, yeah, watching external resources has definitely kind of given me some new ideas to try and incorporate into that.
So Justin asked a question, which maybe you could just answer with a yes or no, essentially.
I think, yeah, I think as a whole, it has furthered the memorization. So at this point, I'm not necessarily thinking about the music too much, but now I'm thinking more about the movement. So I think it's definitely helped solidify.
So this is where I'm going to jump in and ask Nathan and Dustin, we'll start with Nathan to talk about movement and memorization. Does the chicken or the egg come first? Or maybe one comes first and then suddenly it's an egg when you thought it was a chicken, right? And so you're just like, and where do you end up by the end in terms of the memorization, the movement helping your memory, and it being integrated into it? And I know that you both can answer this because we've talked about it, but Nathan, it's a hard question to ask. Nathan, what do you have to say about the topic of movement and memory?
Yeah, so for me, it depends on what piece I'm doing as to whether I do the memorization or the choreography first. There have been, like for the first piece, Tubarama, I had the choreography before I was doing the memorization, but with a Great Train Race, I did the memorization before choreography. But I've always found that when I start doing both, they work together really well, because I think of like the music and the movement then sort of as one single thing, and it just doing one helps with the other. And so then this usually leads to the whole performance feeling like it's not like I'm playing music and then dancing, it's I'm performing the piece. And it all feels like one thing by the end.
What's interesting about that, Jacob, I saw your hand. What's interesting about that I've also mentioned in some conversations is then when you try to perform the piece without the movement, your memory gets like all messed up because you've created these neural pathways and these synapses that understand that this left foot is an F. So you sense the foot and you sense the F and you hear the F, and all of that kind of comes together in sort of like this multivitamin of memory. It really solidifies memory, but it's hard to, when you're first beginning it, to kind of navigate it. So Dustin, what's your response? And then Jacob will jump to you for a quick input.
Yeah, I also found that actually the movement helped with memorization, because like you said, I thought maybe a little differently than when I'm performing a piece. Oftentimes I'll have a more visualization of like the score, whereas when I'm performing Move It with the choreography, I'm more just, I have like a mind map of the space and where I am. And the music, I'm kind of here in my head, but I'm not thinking as much about what's the note here. It just kind of flows naturally because it's the movement of the fingers is linked with the body movement.
Yeah, and the pitch comes into play. And one of the things I've talked about with you guys is solfege is a really important component, because you can't see an F on the staff when you're moving, especially if you're moving in different halls and you're performing these pieces in different concerts, because you're distracted by an exit sign or suddenly there's a curtain or somebody's coughing. But you can hear the solfege, you can hear fa or something, and that step correlates with fa in your head. And so if there's ever a moment of like, ooh, what was that note? You'll hear the fa and you'll know it's an F or something like that. Or you could say F, of course, or F sharp, but solfege is easier. But okay, Jacob, what was your comment or question?
My comment was in regards to the memory and movement with a personal anecdote of pirouette. There were times where I had put that down for like a month or two, and coming back to it, I had to perform it. I was like, oh, I don't know how the memory is going to be, but like doing those movements, like it was so solid, and I was able to kind of be like, oh yeah, this is how this part goes, because I was remembering like, oh, I have to do the moon here, and I have to like jump and do all that. So it's definitely helpful with memory because it kind of solidifies it in a different way than you're used to with just purely memorizing something.
Yeah, it's very powerful. It's like the more the senses you can get involved in memory, the better. And that's why even if you're not choreographing, if you use a mirror when you memorize, it's very important. Or if you put your flute here and you memorize passages by watching your fingers, pianists have access to seeing and violinists, but we don't. because we're over here all the time. But so you've got sight, that is really key. You've got touch, you've got sound, you've got the sound of your voice solfeging or saying B or whatever. You know, it's almost like if you could taste it and smell it, nothing would disturb your memory. So as many senses as you can get involved in memorizing, even if you don't have access to movement, you know, drawing out the notes, creating a visual map, creating a storyline that has visual components, like here's where the sun comes out. All of those elements go into really strong memory. So I think we need to move on to the next person. Emily, that's beautiful. I was thinking about the fact that you're not moving around the room much at this point. And I don't know if that's because of the camera situation, but it kind of has a strength to it to maybe do a version that's not moving around the room and do one that is. I think I would recommend that you explore locomotion like we talked about, but I think there's something powerful too about you just being kind of like in an axis, almost like you're one of those wind up ballerinas in a jewelry box. There's something very jagged and interesting and geometric. And if you, about that idea that you stay in sort of in a box, and if you decide to explore that further, then you know you're going to want more diagonals, maybe more moves where you lift a foot up and you're thinking about, like, if you were in a box, how could you touch all the internal points of that box? But it's really well done and it's exciting to see it come along. Thank you. Okay, Jacob, your turn.
So I just prepared some visual aids, just since this is going to be a bit more history focused. So today we are talking about haute terre and the French Baroque style. This is going to include some ornamentation, some dance styles, as well as some stylistic elements that are present in the French Baroque style. So, as Professor said, Jean-Martin Haute-Terre is a very prolific composer and very influential in the flute and how we have developed our flute playing style. So, Haute-Terre was born in Paris, France. He is the son of Martin Haute-Terre, as well as Marie Crepes. In 1704, he actually succeeded his cousin in the royal court position that his cousin had had. So he came from a very musical family. He lived and studied in Rome early in his career, which is why he received the nickname of Romain, or the Roman, and that nickname carried throughout his life. He spent 2 years employed by Prince Francisco Ruspoli in Rome before adopting that nickname between 1705 and 1707. As Professor stated again, he wrote a method book for the traversa flute, recorder, and oboe. These were published in 1707, as well as a method for musette, published in 1737. His Art de préludaire sur la flûte traversière was published in 1719, and it was Europe's first flute manual, and it was used widely. Numerous other members of the Haute-Terre family were reputed to have been fine woodwind players, including Haute-Terre himself. Some also had decisive impact on woodwind instrument construction. This is what Professor had mentioned earlier, this kind of helping with the designing of the flute, as well as other woodwind instruments. In fact, his grandfather, Jean, was noted for his playing, as well as his innovative building and kind of coming about the modern-day oboe construction. So first, we are going to talk about the ornamentation and style. So I'm going to take us through the various ornaments that are taken in French Baroque music. Some of them are similar to the kind of ornamentation that we are familiar with. However, they are named and notated differently. So I will go through that. But first, I wanted to say that a lot of these ornaments were in his first book of suites for flute and continuo, which was written in 1708. And he summarized the ornamentation in the way that he did. This became standardized through Monteclair in 1724, who spread it throughout France, and it became standard notation throughout France because of Monteclair's influence. So the first one is not in the book, so I don't really have a slide for it, but it is the flattement, which is not described in the chart, provided, however, it is described heavily throughout his Principes de la Flûte Traversière, which is his manual. And flattement is basically a motion similar to a trill by a tone hall. It's often used on the highest tone hall, and it creates a sort of vibrato. So this is what people usually refer to as finger vibrato, is flattement. And it is described as being used on nearly all long notes in the French style. So the first one that is outlined by Hauteterre is the coulement, which is the superior appoggiatura. As you can see, it is notated as superior because it comes from above rather than below. And it is notated by that caret pointing upward. This is said to be used on all descending thirds. So that is the moment when you should be using the coulement in French birth style. Then we have the accent, which is this kind of lifting motion. So da 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 da. And it's somewhat difficult to say where these should be used. However, it is normally added in a bar similar to this one, where you have unequal eighth notes, and it is usually introduced at the end of a dotted quarter note, followed by an eighth note on the same pitch. So that is an accent. Then we have the porte-voix, which is the inferior appoggiatura, and it is notated as the inferior appoggiatura because it is an appoggiatura from below. And this is normally followed by a battement, which we will discuss later. Then we have the porte-voix double, which is basically a double appoggiatura, so it's two notes instead of one, as we saw with the porte-voix. Then we have the demi-cadence appuyé, which is basically what we use with the, it should be made with a higher note that follows by a tremblant, which is a finger vibrato or trill. And the tremblement should be performed on nearly all notes raised by a sharp or natural, except in the cases of very short notes. And it is notated by the caret that we saw with the coulement, as well as a plus, which in Baroque notation symbolizes a trill. Then we have the tour de glacé, which is similar to a turn or a gruppetto, as we tend to know it in the modern Western canon. And it's symbolized the same way as a gruppetto is. Then we have a double cadence, which has a trill followed by a turn downwards, landing on the note notated. The double cadence should be made when a higher note is followed by a, oh, I said this. Okay, so this is for the double cadences should be made when a higher note is followed by a tremblement, finger vibrato or trill, and the tremblement, the trill, should be performed on nearly all notes raised by a sharp or natural. Then we have the double cadence coupé, which is a cut double cadence. Basically, it's the double cadence without the resolution, and it's symbolized like that. Then we have the battement, which is equivalent to a mordent, and it is symbolized with a line. Sometimes it looks like a Roman numeral 1, and it's basically just on the downbeat, you do the mordent downwards. Then we have the tour de chant, which is a cluster mixed with cadence shake, is the English translation of it. And basically, the downward U shape symbolizes that you should do the figure there, you reach the lower note, and then the lower neighbor, and then back, return back, and then a trill. Another thing of Baroque French style is note en égal. Note en égal is a technique that existed in France from the mid-16th century to the late 18th, and it always operates within the beat and never distorts the beat itself. So as you can see here, it kind of creates this dotted rhythm-like figure. However, the degree of inequality can vary between barely noticeable to double dotting. And this kind of inequality is based on the style of the piece as well as the performer's discretion. According to the Grove Music Dictionary, inequality was considered one of the chief resources of expression, and it is varied according to the expressive needs within the same piece or even within a passage. Sometimes the technique is notated to stop by the composer, while sometimes the use of the technique throughout the piece is up to the performer. So now we're going to get into some dance styles. I have two here that were present in Hotteterre's suites. So first, we are going to talk about the dance suites in general. Normally, the order of a dance suite is a prelude allemande, courant, sarabande, gavotte, and a gigue. And the prelude is present in French suites. However, it is omitted from English suites. Hotteterre uses both. He has preludes in some of his suites and omits the prelude in some of his other suites. So he uses both the English and French styles in his suites. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the allemande. The allemande, it is French for German or Germany, and the reason that it is called this is because it is a dance that originated in Germany during the Renaissance. It is a dance that is written in cut time with no syncopation. However, during the 17th century, it was often written in 4/4, and in the 18th century, it transitioned to 2/4. Often the tonal structure, so the harmonic structure of the piece, is ABA, starting in the tonic, going to the dominant, and then back to the tonic. The allemande, in the allemande, the dancers form lined couples, extended their paired hands forward, and paraded back and forth the length of the ballroom, walking 3 steps, then balancing on 1 foot. A livelier version used 3 springing steps and a hop. So now I have a little video of an allemande, and I like this video because it shows the chart of the allemande as well as the dancers dancing to the chart. So So as you can see there, it's kind of a lively dance, and Hotteterre uses it frequently in his dance suites as it is part of a dance suite. And that specific allemande was composed by Lully, who is a very prolific composer, specifically of ballet in France at the time.
Jacob, how far are you from being complete with your presentation?
This is the last slide.
Okay, great. Because I wanted to make sure that people had time to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. So the last dance form that I wanted to discuss that is present in Hotteterre's dance suites is the rondeau. This is not to be confused with the form fixe rondeau present before this time. It appeared, the rondeau, in a variety of forms, from ballet to opera to instrumental music and choirs. So here we have Lully, who composed the allemande that we just listened to, and he was the most important figure in ballet and opera rondeaus. Then we have Chambonnière, and Couperin, who both worked towards the development and standardization of the rondeau as a form in France. Couperin had a student, Rameau, who further refined the form, but Couperin's form was standardized in France. And then Leclerc later contributed to the 18th century rondeau technique, especially in the aria movements of his pieces. So quickly, I'm just going to play for you guys a quick section of one of Hotater's rondos, because although it is not part of the standard Baroque suite, he did write a couple rondos that put into his dance suites. So that was the A section of the rondo, but the rondo form spelled in French here is similar to the rondo form that we are familiar with, which is AB, AC, that kind of thing.
It was a really excellent presentation, Jacob. I vote for Jacob for Professor LaBarge. Yeah, it was really concise and beautifully presented. Excellent. Your timing was excellent too. So I just want to kind of comment that whenever I see that music dance to and the dance of that style, and then I see hip hop, or I think of like everything that's going on today in terms of dance, and there's lots of it. Like, you know, it always strikes me as how confined that music of that time and dance of that time was. But I think in reality, it probably wasn't. You know, people were jamming out and break dancing and doing all kinds of things. It's just that that wasn't being written about. We don't have access to that. And not only was that happening in like, you know, Europe, or maybe not, certain things were not happening in Europe, but that's not to say that the Maya, you know, in South America were not involved in all kinds of movement that's, you know, or even like some tribal movement in the continent of Africa. And, you know, there's so much movement on the planet, and the humans' desire to move is really fascinating, and the languages that are created from movement are really fascinating. But the European movement from that time kind of always makes me go, wow, that's so stiff, you know. Do we have one question for Jacob, maybe? Time for just one quick question or a comment?
I have a question. So you said you were working on a piece by Hotater. How difficult has it been, like getting used to the different notation and using all the techniques properly?
Yeah, so it definitely took a while for me to understand what a lot of the symbols meant, especially because they are standardized in French Baroque notation, but not really used widely throughout, let's say, Italian or even German Baroque notation. So it was definitely difficult to kind of at first connect the two. But once I was able to kind of understand, okay, the plus is a trill, this is, you know, the coulement, the appoggiatura, I was able to kind of connect those dots, but also just kind of know that a lot of what is written on the ornamentation is the publisher and not really Hotater himself. So kind of making those, listening to recordings and making those decisions of what feels natural here, what feels like the music wants to do here, rather than what is specifically notated.
And I'll add to that honestly, I think one of the best ways to approach this, Nathan, is to listen to traverso players and people who've invested their entire, you know, life into this research, because it's a vortex. I mean, the study of ornamentation and the study of appropriate ways of performing music from that general time period in different parts of the world is just intense. And, you know, if you ever get anywhere near it and you'll realize that you can't actually make a statement about any of it, right, Jacob? It's like, you might get into a fight with somebody who studied something else and learned a different thing. So it's about staying flexible, but there's the best way to approach it, I think, is to listen and then write down what you hear them doing. Like put it like, is that an E? Is it on the B? You know, and just kind of put it in your score. And look up different versions of different edited ones, but the styles have been different. Like in the 60s when Baroque, you know, Baroque music wasn't even being played until the 60s. It was kind of forgotten. And that's when it had its re-renaissance. And Jean-Pierre Rampal was one of the people who was involved in that, bringing up the Bach's flute sonatas. They weren't being performed by anybody before then. And so he kind of went in and did his ornamentation and did things that, and took tempos that nobody would take today even, because the research has been extensive since then and has changed over time. So it's kind of a can of worms, as they say. So thank you, everybody. I wanted to just close by saying that for the the final 4 performance classes, we're going to meet in person. Unless you're not comfortable with meeting in person, we'll meet in this room. As the violin studio has been having their studio classes, we'll have ours, you know, wear a mask, all that good stuff. If you don't want to and you would prefer not to, and to submit a recording, that's also okay. But I'm hoping that we can have our last 4 classes in here and hear each other play live. And I think that's it. So thanks for staying 5 minutes extra. Thanks for the cool projects that we're working on, we got to hear about. There are more of them going on in the studio, but this is just what we got to hear today. Okay, and Ashley, you can come on up in like 15 minutes. I've got to make a phone call, but I'll see you in 15. All right, bye everybody. Thank you.